When I placed the DNA test results next to the mashed potatoes at our Thanksgiving dinner table, my husband David's face went white as the tablecloth. "Congratulations," I said calmly, looking directly into his eyes as our children and in-laws watched in confused silence, "on successfully maintaining two complete families for 8 years." His fork clattered to his plate as I slid the manila envelope across the polished oak table. "The results prove that while I was struggling through 3 miscarriages, you were building a perfect little family with Christie Lavigne in Denver. Tell me, David, do you prefer being called Daddy by our kids here?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Or by Mason and Hope out there. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother-in-law's wineglass froze halfway to her lips. My 7-year-old daughter Lucy looked between us with wide, confused eyes. And David Ronald Garson, the man I'd loved and trusted for 12 years, the financial advisor who'd built our comfortable suburban life, the father who read bedtime stories and coached Little League, stared at the evidence of his complete and utter betrayal, with the expression of a man watching his entire world collapse. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this nightmare began, because the truth about David's deception is so much darker and more calculated than even I could have imagined. My name is Rachel Garson, and 3 months ago, I believed I was living exactly the life I'd always dreamed of. We lived in a beautiful colonial home in Westfield, Connecticut, complete with the white picket fence and manicured front lawn that screamed American success story. David was a senior financial advisor at Hartwell and Associates, one of the most prestigious wealth management firms in the state. I worked part-time as a freelance graphic designer, mostly handling marketing materials for local businesses, which gave me the flexibility to be present for our children. Our daughter Lucy was 7. A bright, curious child with David's dark hair and my stubborn streak. Our son Liam was 5, all energy and mischief, constantly asking why about everything from why the sky was blue to why Daddy had to travel for work so much. We'd tried for a third child for years, enduring the heartbreak of 3 miscarriages that nearly broke me emotionally. David had been my rock through those dark times, holding me as I cried, reassuring me that our family was complete and perfect just as it was. From the outside, we had everything. David made excellent money, over $200,000 a year, which afforded us private schools for the children, family vacations to Disney World and Martha's Vineyard, and a social life that revolved around the country club and charity galas. I organized fundraisers for the children's school, hosted dinner parties for David's clients, and maintained the kind of Pinterest-perfect home that other wives envied. "Rachel makes it all possible," David would say at cocktail parties, his arm around my waist as he charmed potential clients. I couldn't focus on building portfolios and securing our clients' futures without knowing my own family was in such capable hands. The other wives would smile politely, but I could see the admiration in their eyes. We were the couple everyone wanted to be, financially secure, physically attractive, with well-behaved children, and a partnership that seemed to weather every storm. I prided myself on being the kind of wife who made David's demanding career possible. When he started traveling more frequently for client meetings, I adjusted our family schedule around his absence. "Denver's becoming a major market for us," he'd explain over breakfast while checking his phone. "The firm is expanding our Western portfolio, and I'm spearheading the initiative. It means more travel, but the partnership track is finally opening up." Partnership meant everything to David. He'd been working toward it for 8 years, ever since we'd moved to Connecticut fresh out of business school. The additional income would secure our children's college funds, allow us to upgrade to the house with the pool we'd been eyeing, maybe even buy that cabin in Vermont we'd talked about. I supported his ambition completely, even when it meant single parenting through Lucy's soccer tournaments and Liam's preschool performances. The travel pattern became predictable. Every other month, David would spend a long weekend in Denver, sometimes stretching it to a full week when he claimed to be conducting comprehensive portfolio reviews for high-net-worth clients. He'd leave on Thursday mornings and return Sunday evenings, exhausted but satisfied with his progress. "Colorado clients are different," he'd tell me over wine after the children were in bed. "They're more outdoorsy, more relaxed, it takes time to build trust, but once you do, they're incredibly loyal. I believed every word. Why wouldn't I? David had never given me reason to doubt him. He was attentive when he was home, engaged with the children, affectionate with me. He remembered anniversaries and birthdays, surprised me with weekend getaways when he wasn't traveling, and still looked at me the way he had when we were dating in college. Our marriage felt solid, built on genuine partnership and mutual respect. The financial benefits of his Denver expansion were evident in our bank statements. David's commissions increased substantially, allowing us to pay off our mortgage early and establish substantial college funds for both children. He was transparent about our finances, including me in investment decisions and retirement planning. "We're building something incredible together, Rack," he'd say, while reviewing our quarterly statements. "By the time I make partner, we'll have true financial freedom." Looking back now, I realize how carefully he managed the narrative. Every detail was perfectly crafted to explain his absences, justify his travel schedule, and account for his increased income. David wasn't just having an affair, he was running a masterful long-term deception that required intricate planning and flawless execution. The man I thought I knew, the partner I trusted with our children's futures and my own heart, was a complete fiction. But I had no idea how deep his betrayal ran until that gray October afternoon, when I found something in his study that would shatter my world completely. What started as a simple favor, organizing his home office for a client presentation, became the beginning of the most devastating discovery of my life. And the truth about Christie Lavigne would prove that David's deception began years before I even suspected anything was wrong. The perfect life I thought we'd built together was nothing more than an elaborate stage set, and I was about to discover that I'd been playing a role in someone else's carefully scripted lie. The discovery that would destroy everything happened on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October. David had called that morning, his voice tight with stress. "Rach, I need you to do me a huge favor. The Pemberton account review got moved up to tomorrow, and my home office is a disaster. Could you organize the files and maybe set up the presentation materials? I know it's a lot to ask, but this could make or break the partnership decision." Of course I said yes. I always said yes when David needed me. After dropping the children at school and my mother-in-law's house respectively, I spent the morning in David's study, sorting through months of scattered documents, client portfolios, and financial projections. The room smelled like his cologne and coffee, familiar and comforting. This was where he built our future, where he worked late into the night, ensuring our family's security. I was organizing his filing cabinet when I noticed a folder wedged behind the back panel, apparently fallen and forgotten. The tab read "Personal Mendiver Properties" in David's neat handwriting. My first thought was that he might be researching investment opportunities for us, perhaps looking into that vacation home we'd discussed. I pulled it free and opened it, expecting to find real estate listings and market analyses. Instead, I found mortgage documents for a house I'd never seen. The address was 2847 Willowbrook Lane, Denver, Colorado. The borrowers listed were David R. Garson and Christie M. Lavigne. My hands began to shake as I read the details. Purchase price $485,000. Down payment $97,000. Closing date March 15, 2019. Just over 4 years ago, right around the time David's Denver expansion had begun generating serious income. But it was the insurance documents that made my legs give out. I sank into David's leather chair, staring at the beneficiary information. Primary policyholder, David Ronald Garson. Secondary policyholder, Christie Marie Lavigne. Listed dependents, Mason James Lavigne Garson, age 6. Hope Elizabeth Lavigne Garson, age 4. The room spun around me. David had children. David had other children. Children whose last names were hyphenated with his, as if they were some kind of blended family. Children who would be covered by his life insurance policy. Children who lived in a house he'd bought with a woman I'd never heard of. I fumbled for my phone, my fingers trembling as I searched for Christie Lavigne on social media. Her Facebook profile was partially private, but her profile picture was visible. A stunning blonde woman with bright blue eyes, maybe 5 years younger than me. The few public photos showed glimpses of family life, birthday parties, playground visits, holiday celebrations. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And in several of them, barely visible but unmistakably present, was David. There he was, pushing a little boy on a swing. David helping a small girl blow out candles on a birthday cake. David sitting on a couch with both children, reading what looked like a bedtime story. The timestamps on these photos spanned years. The oldest I could see was from 2018, a year before they'd apparently bought the house together. My marriage, my partnership, my entire adult life had been built on a lie. While I was suffering through miscarriages, David was playing father to children he'd had with another woman. While I was managing our household and supporting his career, he was building a second life thousands of miles away. Every Denver trip, every late-night phone call he'd taken in private, every dollar of increased income I'd celebrated, all of it had been in service of a deception so massive I couldn't process it. I printed every document in the folder, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind reeled. Property records, insurance policies, school enrollment forms for Mason and Hope, medical records listing David as the emergency contact. There was even a joint bank account I'd never known existed, with regular deposits that matched David's commission schedule and withdrawals for mortgage payments, utilities, and what looked like everyday family expenses. The most damning evidence was a handwritten note tucked into the back of the folder, clearly in David's writing. See, mortgage payment due 15th, M's soccer registration by Friday, H's dentist app next Tuesday 3 p.m. Love you both, DD. The casual intimacy of it, the domestic details, the love you both. This wasn't an affair. This was a parallel marriage. David wasn't just cheating on me. He was living a completely separate life with a completely separate family. He was waking up in Christie's bed, having breakfast with Mason and Hope, helping with homework and attending school events. He was being the father to them that he was to Lucy and Liam, except there was nothing divided about his attention when he was in Denver. They had all of him. I sat in that chair for hours, surrounded by evidence of my husband's double life, trying to understand how I'd been so blind. Every business trip suddenly made sense in a horrible new way. Every time he'd seemed distracted or distant when he returned. Every phone call he'd taken privately. Every time he'd deflected when I'd asked specific questions about his Denver clients. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. The worst part was remembering how supportive I'd been, how I'd praised his dedication, adjusted our family schedule around his travel, celebrated his success. I'd been the perfect wife, facilitating my own betrayal while David built a second family with the money and time that should have belonged to us. That evening, when David returned from his client dinner, I was waiting in the living room with a glass of wine, and what I hoped looked like my usual welcoming smile. The children were asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet except for the soft jazz playing from our sound system, the same music we'd always used to unwind after long days. "Hey beautiful," David said, loosening his tie as he crossed the room to kiss my forehead. "Sorry I'm so late." The Henderson portfolio review ran way longer than expected. He looked tired but content, the same expression he'd worn for years after successful business meetings. "How were the kids? Did Liam finish his math homework?" "All done," I replied, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. "David, can we talk for a minute? I need to ask you something." He settled into his favorite armchair, the one positioned across from the couch where I sat. For 12 years, this had been our place for important conversations, planning vacations, discussing the children's schools, deciding on major purchases. Tonight, it felt like a courtroom. "I was organizing your office today for the Pemberton presentation." I began carefully, watching his face for any reaction. "I found some documents that confused me. Property papers for a house in Denver, with someone named Christie Lavigne." David's expression didn't change immediately, but I caught the split-second tightening around his eyes. He leaned back slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried that same patient tone he used when explaining complex financial concepts to our children. "Oh, that. It's a complicated investment situation, Rock. Christie is a client, a widow who needed help structuring a property purchase for tax purposes. Sometimes we have to get creative with ownership arrangements to maximize benefits for our clients. It's all above board, but the paperwork can look confusing to anyone outside the industry. The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly, so confidently, that for a moment I almost believed him. This was the David I knew, the financial expert who could navigate complex transactions, the husband who always had logical explanations for everything. But I'd seen the insurance documents, I'd seen the children listed as dependents. What about the children? I asked quietly. Mason and Hope Lavigne Gayward Arson? They're listed on insurance policies with your name. This time, the pause was longer. David rubbed his temples, suddenly looking older than his 34 years. Rachel, you're reading way too much into standard legal documents. When you're dealing with blended families and estate planning, especially with significant assets involved, these arrangements protect everyone involved. Christie's children from her previous marriage needed coverage during the property transition. Blended families, I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. David, these children have your last name hyphenated with hers. There are photos of you with them on her social media. His face hardened then, the patient explanation mask slipping away. You went through my private files, and then stalked my client on social media. Jesus, Rachel, when did you become so paranoid and controlling? The accusation hit like a physical blow. Paranoid, controlling. In one sentence, he'd made me the villain of this conversation. I wasn't stalking anyone, David. I was trying to understand why my husband appears to have another family. Another family. David stood up abruptly, his voice rising enough that I worried about waking the children. Do you hear how insane you sound right now? I work my ass off to provide for this family, to build our future, and this is what I come home to. Accusations and conspiracy theories. He began pacing, his hands running through his hair in a gesture I'd always found endearing when he was stressed about work. Now it felt calculated, performative. Christie is going through a difficult time, Rachel. Her husband died in a car accident 2 years ago, and she's been struggling to manage her finances and care for her kids. Part of my job, part of what makes me good at what I do, is going above and beyond for clients who needed extra support. So you bought a house with her. I helped structure a purchase that gave her the best possible terms and tax advantages. Yes, my name is on some documents, because that's how these arrangements work. And yes, I spend time with her children, because they lost their father, and sometimes need a positive male role model. His voice had taken on a righteous tone now, as if I were attacking his charity work instead of questioning his fidelity. And the photos, you reading bedtime stories, attending birthday parties. David stopped pacing, and looked at me with what seemed like genuine hurt. Rachel, those kids have been through hell. When I'm in Denver for business, sometimes Christie asks if I can help with them. Mason has nightmares about his dad's accident, and Hope barely speaks to adults outside her family. If spending a few hours helping them feel safe and loved makes me a bad husband, then I guess I don't understand what kind of man you want me to be. The manipulation was masterful. In less than 10 minutes, he'd transformed himself from the perpetrator of a massive deception into a humanitarian helping orphan children. He'd made my reasonable questions seem like jealous paranoia. He'd positioned my discovery of evidence as a violation of his privacy and professional ethics. But I'd seen too much. The mortgage documents, the insurance policies, the intimate handwritten note. This wasn't charitable work or client service. This was a man living two completely separate lives, and he was lying to my face with the same smooth confidence he used to sell investment strategies to his clients. I want to believe you, I said finally, and part of me meant it. Despite everything I'd discovered, part of me still desperately wanted David's explanation to be true. I wanted to return to our perfect life, to trust my husband, to believe that our marriage was what I thought it was. Then believe me, David said, his voice soft again as he sat back down. Rach, I love you. I love our family. Everything I do is for us, for our future. Sometimes my work requires complicated arrangements that don't look conventional from the outside, but my commitment to you and the kids has never wavered. He reached across the space between us and took my hand, his thumb tracing circles on my palm the way he had since our college days. I know this looks suspicious, and I should have explained the Denver situation better from the beginning, but I didn't want to burden you with the details of Christie's tragedy or make you worry about me getting too involved with a client's personal problems. The touch, the eye contact, the vulnerable admission of not wanting to worry me, it was everything I wanted to hear. David was giving me an escape route, a way to return to our comfortable illusion. All I had to do was accept his explanation and pretend I hadn't seen what I'd seen. But as I looked into his eyes, I realized I was seeing a stranger. I pretended to accept David's explanation that night, nodding and squeezing his hand when he promised to be more transparent about his complex client relationships. We went to bed like we had thousands of times before, but I lay awake staring at the ceiling while David slept peacefully beside me, his breathing deep and regular. The man who could lie so effortlessly to my face about having another family was sleeping the sleep of the innocent. Over the next 2 weeks, I began noticing things I'd somehow missed before. The way David always took his phone into the bathroom during his morning shower, how he'd developed a habit of checking messages during dinner, claiming they were urgent client communications that couldn't wait. The subtle changes in his cologne. Occasionally he'd smell different when he returned from Denver, like he'd been using someone else's soap or shampoo. Most telling were the small inconsistencies in his travel stories. He'd mentioned having dinner at a steakhouse called Romano's during his last Denver trip, but when I looked it up online, Romano's had been closed for renovations that entire week. He'd talked about a challenging client meeting at the Marriott downtown, but his credit card statement showed a charge at a suburban grocery store instead, the kind of charge you'd make when picking up milk and bread for a family. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early November. David was upstairs packing for another Denver trip, and his laptop was open on the kitchen counter, logged into his email. I told myself I was just checking the weather forecast, but instead I found myself clicking on his sent messages. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Mixed in with legitimate business correspondence were emails to Christie that read like love letters. Can't wait to be home with you and the kids. Read one from just 2 days earlier. Mason's soccer game is Saturday at 10, right? Don't want to miss it. Another from the previous week. Hope's teacher conference went well. She's so smart, just like her mom. See you tonight. Love, D. Home. He called Denver home when writing to Christie. Our house in Connecticut, where we'd built 12 years of memories, where our children took their first steps and lost their first teeth, that was apparently just his other residence. But it was the email thread titled Thanksgiving Plans that destroyed any lingering doubt. David had written to Christie, looking forward to our first Thanksgiving as a real family. Can't believe Mason is old enough to help with the turkey carving this year. Should I pick up wine on my way home Wednesday, or do you have it covered? Thanksgiving. The holiday I'd been planning for weeks, making sure David's favorite dishes would be perfect, coordinating with both sets of grandparents for our traditional family celebration. He was planning to spend it in Denver with Christie and her children while I hosted our families alone, making excuses for his absence. I screenshot every email, my hands shaking as I forwarded them to my personal account. The evidence was overwhelming now. This wasn't a business relationship or charitable work. David was planning holidays and attending parent-teacher conferences with another woman's children. He was living as their stepfather while maintaining the fiction that I was his only wife. The most devastating email was one I almost missed, buried in a thread from 6 months earlier. Christie had written, "The kids are asking when we can tell people you're their stepdad officially. I know we talked about waiting until the finances are more settled, but Mason wants to bring you to show and tell as his dad. What should I tell him?" David's response was swift and clear. "Let's wait until after the divorce is finalized. Rachel doesn't suspect anything yet, and I want to make sure the asset division goes smoothly before we go public. The kids will understand, they're both so smart. Just a few more months and we can be completely open about our family." The divorce. David was planning to divorce me, and I'd had no idea. While I was organizing school fundraisers and hosting his client dinners, he was strategizing how to leave me with minimal financial impact to himself. The increased income I'd celebrated, the partnership track he'd been pursuing, it was all preparation for abandoning our family, while ensuring his comfortable life with Christie continued uninterrupted. I sat in our kitchen, surrounded by the life we'd built together, reading about how my husband planned to dismantle it all. The coffee mug in my hands, a Mother's Day gift from Lucy 3 years ago, felt like a relic from someone else's life. The family photos on the refrigerator, the children's artwork covering every available surface, the meal planning calendar where I'd carefully noted David's travel schedule, it was all evidence of how thoroughly I'd been deceived. The sound of David's footsteps on the stairs jolted me back to the present. I quickly closed his laptop and busied myself making his travel coffee, the same ritual I'd performed dozens of times before. But everything felt different now. Every loving gesture felt like a performance, every kiss goodbye like a betrayal. All set for Denver? I asked as he entered the kitchen, his suitcase in hand. Unfortunately, yes. Busy few days ahead, but hopefully we can wrap up the Morrison account restructure. He accepted his coffee and kissed my cheek, the same routine we'd maintained for years. I should be back Sunday evening, but there's a chance it might stretch to Monday if the documentation takes longer than expected. Monday. According to his emails, he was planning to spend Thanksgiving weekend with Christie and the children, returning only when our own holiday preparations would be complete. He'd miss Lucy's school play on Friday, and Liam's soccer game on Saturday, but he'd be there for Mason's game and Hope's dance recital. Drive safely, I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. The kids and I will miss you. Miss you too, he replied, but his attention was already shifting to his phone as a text notification appeared. I caught a glimpse of the sender name, Christie, with a heart emoji next to it. As I watched David drive away that morning, I realized I was mourning not just my marriage, but my entire understanding of reality. The man I'd loved and trusted for 12 years was a complete fiction. The partnership I'd believed in, the future we'd planned together, the family we'd built, none of it was real from his perspective. It's 6 months second subad. We 40 shil varied. With buddy 47 if 2 divorced me strategically, making sure the asset division favored him, then I needed to start planning strategically too. And I needed to understand exactly how deep this betrayal went, starting with finding out the truth about Christie Lavigne and how long she'd been planning to destroy my marriage. That afternoon, while Lucy was at gymnastics and Liam was at his friend's house, I called my sister Joy. We'd always been close, but I'd kept my marriage problems private, not wanting to burden her with my suspicions when I wasn't even sure what I was dealing with. Now I needed someone I could trust completely. I need your help with something, I said, without preamble when she answered. And I need you to promise me you won't judge what I'm about to ask you to do. Joy Hammer had always been the more practical of the two of us. While I'd focused on creating the perfect home and supporting David's career, she'd built her own successful marketing consultancy and maintained a healthy skepticism about people's motives. What's going on, Rack? You sound terrible. David's having an affair. More than an affair, he has another family. I need help investigating, and I can't do it alone. The silence stretched for several seconds before Joy responded. Jesus, are you sure? I have proof. Documents, emails, photos. Joy, he's been living a double life for years, and I think the other woman might have orchestrated the whole thing. I filled her in on everything I'd discovered, reading her portions of David's emails and describing the house purchase documents. Okay, Joy said, her voice shifting into business mode. First, we need professional help. I know a private investigator who specializes in infidelity and financial fraud cases. Her name is Lucas Ronald. I know, confusing with the name, but she's the best. Second, we need to figure out who Christie Lavigne really is and what her game plan was from the beginning. Lucas Ronald turned out to be a former police detective who'd transitioned into private investigation after 15 years in law enforcement. She had silver hair, sharp eyes, and a no-nonsense attitude that immediately put me at ease. We met at her office 2 days later, a modest space filled with filing cabinets and computer equipment. I've handled dozens of cases like this, Lucas said, reviewing the documents I'd brought. But there are some red flags here that suggest this goes beyond a typical affair. The timeline, the financial arrangements, the way she's integrated herself into his life, this has all the hallmarks of a long-term financial con. She pulled up Christie's social media profiles on her computer, pointing out details I'd missed. Look at the progression of her posts. 3 years ago, she's posting about financial struggles as a single mother. Lots of posts about needing to move, can't afford rent, kids needing school supplies. Then suddenly, 2.5 years ago, the tone changes completely. New house, private schools for the kids, family vacations. Right around when David's Denver business started taking off, I realized. Exactly. And look at this. Lucas clicked on a photo from 3 years ago, showing Christie at what appeared to be a financial planning seminar. The timestamp puts this just 2 weeks before David's first documented Denver trip. She was researching financial advisors, Rachel. This wasn't a chance meeting, she targeted him specifically. Over the next hour, Lucas outlined what a professional investigation would reveal. Background checks on Christie, financial forensics to trace money flows, surveillance to document their relationship, and research into whether David was the first married man she'd targeted this way. I need to warn you, Lucas said as our meeting concluded, what we find might be worse than what you already know. If Christie is running a long-term con, your husband might not be her first victim. And if she's been planning this for years, she's probably already positioned herself to come out ahead in any divorce proceedings. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks earlier. I opened a private bank account using money from a small inheritance my grandmother had left me. Money David didn't even know existed, because I'd never mentioned it, viewing it as my personal emergency fund. It was enough to pay Lucas for a comprehensive investigation, and to ensure I had resources David couldn't access or freeze. I also called Patricia Winters, the most ruthless divorce attorney in our area. Her reputation was legendary. She specialized in high-asset divorces, where one spouse was hiding money or maintaining secret relationships. Her consultation fee was substantial, but I needed someone who could outmaneuver David's inevitable legal strategy. Based on what you've described, Patricia said during our initial phone consultation, your husband has been systematically moving assets and establishing financial obligations that will complicate any divorce settlement. The house purchase in Denver, the insurance policies, the joint accounts. He's creating a paper trail that makes him look financially overextended while actually securing his future with his other family. So he's been planning this divorce for years. It appears so. The good news is that if we can prove deliberate asset hiding and bigamous behavior, the courts will not look favorably on his strategy. The better news is that you've discovered this before he's initiated proceedings, which gives us time to build our own strategy. That night, I sat in David's study, the same room where I'd first discovered his betrayal, and began planning my counterattack. I photographed every document I could find, copied files from his computer, and methodically documented every financial account and investment I could locate. But it was while going through his business card collection that I found something that chilled me to the bone. Tucked behind cards from legitimate clients was one that read Christie Lavigne, Financial Recovery Specialist, with a Denver phone number. The card was worn and creased, suggesting David had carried it for years. Financial Recovery Specialist wasn't a legitimate profession. It was the kind of vague title someone would use if they made their living helping people hide assets or manipulate financial situations. Christie wasn't just David's mistress, or even just a con artist targeting wealthy men. She was a professional financial predator, and David wasn't her victim, he was her partner. The scope of their deception was far more calculated and far more extensive than I'd imagined. This wasn't a love affair that had gotten complicated. This was a business partnership designed to defraud me and potentially others. David hadn't fallen for Christie's charms. He'd hired her expertise to help him systematically dismantle our marriage while protecting his own financial interests. As I sat surrounded by evidence of their conspiracy, I realized I wasn't just fighting for my marriage or my children's security. I was fighting against two people who had spent years planning to destroy my life for their own profit. Lucas's investigation moved faster than I'd expected. Within a week, she'd uncovered Christie's real background, and the truth was more disturbing than my worst suspicions. Christie Marie Lavigne had been running financial cons for at least 6 years, targeting wealthy married men through carefully orchestrated meetings at business conferences and financial seminars. She's not from Denver originally, Lucas explained during our follow-up meeting. Born in Phoenix, moved to Las Vegas at 18, and has lived in 4 different states over the past decade, always using variations of the same identity, always targeting men in finance or real estate. Lucas slid a folder across her desk containing background reports on 3 other men Christie had targeted. Marcus Thompson in Phoenix, whose wife discovered their joint bank account had been drained after he'd been planning to leave her for Christie. James Miller in Las Vegas, who'd transferred property into Christie's name just months before his wife filed for divorce. And Kevin O'Brien in Salt Lake City, who'd lost nearly $300,000 in what he thought were joint investments with Christie before she disappeared from his life entirely. The pattern is always the same, Lucas continued. She identifies men with substantial assets and unhappy marriages, presents herself as needing financial guidance, and slowly builds a relationship that becomes both romantic and financial. She's brilliant at making these men feel like heroes, rescuing her while also feeling appreciated in ways their wives allegedly don't provide. But the most shocking discovery was in Christie's employment history. She'd briefly worked as a paralegal for a high-end divorce firm in Phoenix, where she'd learned the intricacies of asset hiding, property transfers, and the legal strategies used in contentious divorces. She wasn't just targeting these men randomly, she was using professional knowledge to help them prepare for divorces while ensuring she benefited from the asset divisions. David isn't her victim, Rachel, Lucas said bluntly. He's her business partner. Based on the financial documents you've provided and my investigation into their joint accounts, they've been systematically moving money into investments and properties that would be difficult to trace in divorce proceedings. Your husband hired Christie to help him plan the perfect divorce, one where he'd end up with most of the assets while appearing to be financially constrained. The evidence was overwhelming. David had been paying Christie a consulting fee, disguised as client payments, for nearly 3 years. In return, she'd helped him establish the Denver property, create complicated financial arrangements, and develop a timeline for leaving our marriage that would minimize his financial losses. The children, Mason and Hope, weren't David's biological children at all. They were props in Christie's con, borrowed from her actual sister who lived in Denver and was paid to participate in their deception. The photos on social media, the school documents, even the insurance policies listing them as dependents, it's all fabricated, Lucas explained. Mason and Hope are real children, but they're not David's. They visit Christie occasionally, and have been coached to call David Dad when he's around. Their real father is very much alive and has no idea his children are being used in financial fraud. I felt physically sick reading the reports. David hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he'd constructed an elaborate criminal conspiracy, and I'd been funding it through our joint accounts, supporting my own financial destruction while believing I was helping build our family's future. But Lucas had more devastating news. We have evidence that David and Christie are accelerating their timeline. Based on surveillance and intercepted communications, they're planning to initiate divorce proceedings right after the holidays. David's recent business success has been carefully staged to make it appear that his income peaked just before your separation, which would minimize alimony calculations. The plan was diabolical in its thoroughness. David would claim that his Denver business had been unsuccessful, that Christie had been a problematic client who'd caused financial losses, and that he was actually in a precarious financial position. The Denver house would be presented as a bad investment he was stuck with, rather than the love nest he'd purchased for his real life. Christie would disappear from Denver, their joint accounts would be emptied, and David would start over with a clean slate and most of our marital assets safely hidden in investments I'd never known existed. How long do we have? I asked, trying to process the scope of their deception. Based on the communications we've intercepted, David plans to serve you with divorce papers in early January. That gives us about 6 weeks to prepare our counteroffensive. Lucas's smile was sharp and confident. The good news is that everything they've done is documented. Financial fraud, conspiracy, identity theft related to the fake family situation. They've committed multiple felonies while planning to steal your life savings. What do? We let them think their plan is working while we build a case that will destroy them both. I've already contacted the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. What David and Christie have done crosses state lines and involves substantial sums of money. This isn't just a divorce case anymore, Rachel. It's a federal criminal investigation. That evening, I sat in my living room looking at photos of Lucy and Liam playing in our backyard, understanding for the first time that David had been planning to abandon them too. His emails to Christie had mentioned that children from his first marriage would complicate their new life together, and they'd discussed ways to minimize his custody obligations and child support payments. My husband wasn't just leaving me for another woman. He was discarding our entire family like we were obstacles to his real happiness, and he'd been planning it methodically for years, using our money and my trust to fund his escape from the life we'd built together. But now, I knew the truth. And I had 6 weeks to make sure that when David tried to destroy our family, he'd discover that I was no longer the trusting, supportive wife he thought he was manipulating. I was becoming someone he'd never met before, someone who would fight for my children and my future with every resource at my disposal. The hardest part of the next few weeks was maintaining the illusion that nothing had changed. David returned from his Denver trip on Sunday evening as promised, full of stories about difficult clients and complex financial restructuring. He kissed me hello, helped Liam with his homework, and listened patiently while Lucy practiced her violin. To anyone watching, we looked like the perfect suburban family settling into our evening routine, but I was studying him now with completely different eyes. Every gesture felt calculated, every show of affection performed rather than genuine. When he complained about the stress of his Denver work, I heard a man building his excuse for eventual divorce. When he mentioned how exhausting the travel was becoming, I recognized him laying groundwork for claims that his income was unsustainable. Patricia thinks we should consider couples counseling, I mentioned casually one evening as we cleaned up after dinner. This was part of Lucas's strategy, create a paper trail showing that I was trying to save our marriage while David was secretly planning to end it. David's reaction was perfectly predictable. Do we really need that? I mean, we're going through a stressful period with my work expansion, but that's temporary. Once I get the Denver situation stabilized, things will calm down. I just feel like we're not connecting the way we used to, I pressed gently. Maybe talking to someone would help us navigate this transition better. Let's table it until after the holidays, David suggested, exactly as Lucas had predicted he would. I don't want to add more stress to an already complicated time. We can reassess in January. When he planned to serve me with divorce papers and claim that our marriage had deteriorated due to the stress of his work situation. He was already scripting the narrative that would justify his abandonment of our family. Meanwhile, Lucas's investigation was uncovering more damaging evidence daily. FBI financial crimes investigator agent Sarah Martinez had joined our team, and her analysis of David and Christie's financial activities revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that went far beyond hiding marital assets. They've been using the Denver property as a base for investment fraud. Agent Martinez explained during a meeting at Lucas's office. Christie identifies wealthy clients through David's business connections, then convinces them to invest in fake real estate developments. David provides the financial credibility and handles the money transfers. They've stolen over $2 million from at least 8 different investors over the past 2 years. The scope kept expanding. David wasn't just planning to divorce me and steal our assets. He was running a criminal enterprise using his professional reputation and our marriage as cover. Some of the business trips I'd supported so enthusiastically had actually been meetings with their fraud victims, elderly couples and retired individuals who trusted David's financial expertise. We have recorded conversations between David and Christie discussing their exit strategy, Agent Martinez continued. Once they've maximized their take from current victims, they plan to disappear together. David would divorce you, claim financial hardship, liquidate what assets he can, and then vanish. Christie would abandon her Denver identity entirely. They've already established new identities and offshore accounts in preparation. I sat in that office, understanding that my husband hadn't just betrayed our marriage, he'd used our entire life as a front for criminal activity. Every dinner party I'd hosted, every client relationship I'd helped him cultivate, every moment of social respectability I'd provided had been weaponized to steal from innocent people. But we weren't going to let them disappear. The FBI was building a case that would result in federal charges for both David and Christie. Lucas was documenting every asset they'd hidden, every false statement they'd made, every victim they'd defrauded. and Patricia was preparing divorce papers that would freeze all assets and establish a legal framework for recovering every stolen dollar. The breakthrough came when Lucas discovered that David had made a critical error. In his confidence that I would never discover his deception, he'd used our home computer to access some of his criminal accounts. Our joint computer, which meant I had legal access to any evidence found on it. He's been sloppy, Lucas reported with satisfaction. We have screen captures of cryptocurrency transfers, communications with offshore banking services, and detailed spreadsheets tracking their stolen funds. David documented his own crimes because he never imagined you'd be smart enough to find them. That stung, but it also clarified something important. David had underestimated me so completely that he'd gotten careless. The supportive, trusting wife he thought he was manipulating had become his biggest vulnerability. While he and Christie had been planning their brilliant escape, I'd been methodically building the case that would destroy them both. The final piece fell into place when Agent Martinez informed us that Christie's previous victims had agreed to testify. Marcus Thompson, James Miller, and Kevin O'Brien, the men from Phoenix, Las Vegas, and Salt Lake City, had all been contacted by the FBI and were eager to see Christie and her accomplices prosecuted. We have enough evidence for multiple federal charges, Agent Martinez explained. Wire fraud, money laundering, identity theft, conspiracy, and RICO violations for running a continuing criminal enterprise. David and Christie are looking at decades in federal prison if convicted. As Thanksgiving approached, I knew exactly how I wanted to handle the confrontation. David was planning to spend the holiday with Christie in Denver, then return home Sunday to begin his final phase of preparation for our divorce. He had no idea that federal agents would be waiting for him at the Denver airport, or that I'd be serving him with my own legal papers at our Thanksgiving dinner. But first, I needed to protect my children, and ensure they understood that none of this was their fault. Lucy and Liam deserved to know the truth about their father before they heard it from news reports or school friends, and they deserved to understand that our family, while forever changed, would survive this betrayal stronger than before. The perfect suburban wife that David had manipulated for years was gone. In her place was someone he'd never expected to face. A woman who'd learned exactly how dangerous she could be when fighting for her children's future. The week before Thanksgiving, David announced that he needed to make an emergency trip to Denver. The Morrison account is imploding, he explained over breakfast, not meeting my eyes as he stirred his coffee. Christie's been mismanaging some of the documentation, and if I don't get out there to fix it personally, we could lose everything we've worked for. I nodded sympathetically, playing my role perfectly. That's terrible timing with the holiday coming up. How long will you need to be there? I'll leave Wednesday morning, and hopefully be back by Friday evening, Saturday at the latest. He reached across and squeezed my hand. I'm sorry, Roch. I know how much work you've put into Thanksgiving dinner, and I hate missing time with the kids. Family first, I replied, the irony of those words bitter in my mouth. We'll just adjust the timing. Maybe we can do our celebration on Sunday instead. What David didn't know was that Agent Martinez and her team would be conducting surveillance throughout his Denver trip. Every meeting with Christie, every conversation about their criminal enterprise, every detail of their Thanksgiving plans would be recorded. More importantly, they would document that David was maintaining a second household while married to me, which would support additional charges of bigamy and fraud. But first, I had to have the most difficult conversation of my life with my children. That Tuesday evening, after David had left for his Wednesday morning flight, I sat Lucy and Liam down in our living room with hot chocolate, and the kind of serious expression they'd learned meant important family news. I need to tell you both something about Daddy, I began, my voice steady despite the way my heart was racing. And I need you to know that none of this is your fault, and it doesn't change how much Daddy loves you or how much I love you. Lucy, perceptive as always, immediately tensed. Is Daddy sick? No, sweetheart, Daddy isn't sick, but he has been making some very bad choices. Choices that are going to change our family. I took a deep breath, drawing on every piece of advice Patricia had given me about explaining divorce to children. Daddy has been lying to us. He's been living another life in Denver with another woman, and he's been planning to leave our family. The silence that followed was deafening. Liam looked confused, too young to fully grasp what I was telling him. But Lucy's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, hurt, and then anger. "Is that why he's always traveling?" she asked quietly.
Yes, baby.
The business trips to Denver weren't really for work. Daddy has been living with another family there, pretending to be their father and husband while still being married to me. "But that's not allowed," Liam said, his 7-year-old sense of justice offended. "You can't have two families." "You're absolutely right, Liam. It's not allowed, and it's not fair to anyone involved. That's why there are going to be consequences for Daddy's choices." I pulled both children closer to me on the couch. "On Thursday, when Daddy comes home for Thanksgiving dinner, some police officers are going to arrest him. Not because he stopped loving us, but because he broke laws when he stole money from people and lied about having two families." Lucy started crying then, the kind of silent tears that broke my heart completely. "Are we going to be okay, Mommy?" "We are absolutely going to be okay," I said with more confidence than I felt. "It's going to be different, and it's going to be sad sometimes, but we're going to be fine. Daddy made his choices, and now we get to make ours. And I choose to make sure you two have the most amazing life possible." The rest of that evening was spent answering their questions, reassuring them about practical concerns, like school and friends and Christmas, and helping them understand that their father's criminal behavior didn't reflect on them or their worth. I called both sets of grandparents, and my sister Joy, ensuring that our support system would be ready to help the children process what was about to happen. Wednesday morning arrived with crisp autumn air, and the kind of clear skies that made everything seem possible. David left for the airport at 6 a.m., kissing me goodbye, and promising to call when he landed. "I love you," he said at the door, and for a moment I almost believed he meant it. "I love you too," I replied, and realized it was the last lie I would ever tell him. Lucas called me an hour later, with updates from the surveillance team. "He's boarding the flight to Denver as scheduled. Agent Martinez has eyes on Christie's house, and we've confirmed that David has a key and his own parking space in the garage. This isn't a hotel situation, Rachel, he's living there." Over the next 2 days, I received regular updates about David's activities in Denver. He attended Mason's soccer game on Thursday morning, took Hope to a dance class that afternoon, and spent Thursday evening at what appeared to be Christie's family Thanksgiving dinner. Photos from the surveillance showed him carving turkey, playing with the children, and acting every inch the devoted stepfather and partner. Meanwhile, I was putting the finishing touches on my own Thanksgiving preparation. Not just the meal, though I was making David's favorite dishes one last time, but the careful orchestration of his downfall. Patricia had prepared a comprehensive legal package that would be served immediately after his arrest. Agent Martinez had coordinated with local law enforcement to ensure the children would be protected during the confrontation. And Lucas had assembled every piece of evidence we'd gathered into a presentation that would make David's guilt undeniable. Friday afternoon, David called to say he'd resolved the Denver situation and would be home in time for our rescheduled Thanksgiving dinner on Sunday. "I can't wait to see you and the kids," he said, his voice warm with what sounded like genuine affection. "I missed you so much this week." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. He'd spent 3 days playing house with his other family, living the life he'd chosen over ours, and now he was coming home to continue manipulating us until he was ready to discard us permanently. But this time, I was ready for him. This time, he'd discover that the woman waiting for him wasn't the trusting wife he'd left behind. She was someone who'd learned exactly what she was capable of when her children's future was threatened. Sunday morning, I woke up early and began preparing what would be our last family meal together. As I chopped vegetables and seasoned the turkey, I felt a sense of calm determination I'd never experienced before. Today, David Garson would discover that his perfect crime had one fatal flaw. He'd underestimated the woman whose life he'd decided to destroy. By the time David's key turned in the front door at 4 p.m., everything was in place. The dining room table was set with our best china, the same spode pattern we'd received as wedding gifts 12 years ago. The turkey was golden brown and resting, surrounded by all of David's favorite side dishes. Our parents had arrived an hour earlier, and Lucy and Liam were playing quietly in the living room. Understanding that today would be different, but not quite comprehending how dramatically. "Smells incredible in here," David called out as he dropped his luggage in the foyer. His voice carried that particular warmth he used when he was genuinely happy, and for a moment I felt a pang of sadness for what we could have been if he'd chosen differently. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking relaxed and genuinely pleased to be home. 3 days in Denver with Christie had clearly recharged him. His smile was easy, his shoulders loose, his eyes bright, with what I now recognized as relief at being with the family he actually wanted. "How was the flight?" I asked, accepting his kiss on the cheek with the same grace I'd shown for years. "Delayed, as usual, but worth it to get home to you." He wrapped his arms around me from behind as I stirred the gravy, exactly as he had that morning weeks ago, when I'd first discovered his secret files. "The Denver situation is finally resolved. Christie's learned her lesson about proper documentation, and I think we can move forward without any more complications." The casual way he lied, even now, was breathtaking. According to Agent Martinez's surveillance reports, David had spent his final morning in Denver discussing escape plans with Christie, reviewing their hidden assets, and finalizing their timeline for disappearing together after New Year's. There had been no business crisis, no client emergency, no professional crisis requiring his intervention. "I'm glad everything worked out," I replied, my voice steady. "The kids missed you. Lucy has been practicing a new violin piece she wants to play for you after dinner. Can't wait to hear it." David released me and moved to greet his parents and mine, slipping effortlessly into the role of devoted son-in-law and father. As I watched him hug our children and charm our relatives with stories of his challenging business trip, I marveled at his ability to compartmentalize. This wasn't a man struggling with guilt or torn between two lives. This was someone who viewed deception as a professional skill. Dinner proceeded exactly as it had every year for the past decade. David carved the turkey with practiced skill, while telling amusing stories about difficult clients. Our parents shared family news and asked about his business expansion. Lucy and Liam chattered about school and friends, basking in their father's attention after his absence. To anyone watching, we were the picture of American family success. But I was counting down minutes now, waiting for the signal that would change everything. At 6:30 p.m., exactly as planned, my phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. "Team in position, ready when you are." I excused myself to check on dessert, stepping into the kitchen to send my reply. "Now." When I returned to the dining room, David was describing his latest Denver developments to my father, painting Christie as a problematic but ultimately manageable client who required extensive hand-holding. "Some people just don't understand the complexity of wealth management," he was saying. "They want results without putting in the work to understand the process." "Well," I said, my voice cutting through his explanation, "I think it's time we talked about some processes that have been confusing me too." Something in my tone made everyone look up. David's expression shifted slightly, his professional charm wavering as he registered that something had changed in the room's dynamic. "I've been learning quite a lot about wealth management lately," I continued, moving to the sideboard where I'd placed the manila envelopes Lucas had prepared. "About asset hiding, money laundering, and the proper documentation for managing multiple family situations." David's face went very still. "Rachel, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Christie Lavigne, about Mason and Hope, about the house at 2847 Willowbrook Lane in Denver." I placed the first envelope on the table in front of him. "About the $2 million you've stolen from elderly investors, about your plans to divorce me in January and disappear with your criminal partner." The silence was absolute. Our parents stared in confusion, not yet understanding what they were witnessing. Lucy and Liam looked between us with growing alarm, and David sat frozen, his face cycling through emotions as he realized that his perfect deception had been discovered. "I don't know what you think you've found," he began, his voice carrying that same patient tone he'd used weeks ago, when I'd first confronted him, "but you're clearly misunderstanding some complex financial arrangements." "David," I interrupted, my voice steady and calm, "the FBI has been watching you for weeks. They have recordings of your conversations with Christie. They've documented your fraud victims. They know about your escape plans and your hidden assets." His fork clattered to his plate. "That's impossible, is it?" I placed the second envelope on the table. This contains DNA test results. Real ones, this time, not the fake family situation you've been maintaining in Denver. Mason and Hope aren't your children, David. They're Christie's sister's kids, borrowed to make your deception more convincing. The color drained from his face as the scope of what I knew became clear. This wasn't the confused, paranoid wife he'd been manipulating for months. This was someone who had methodically unraveled every aspect of his criminal conspiracy. The third envelope, I said, placing it next to the others, contains divorce papers. I'm filing first, David, with full documentation of your fraud, bigamy, and conspiracy charges. The courts will freeze all assets, reverse your hidden transfers, and ensure that every stolen dollar is returned to your victims. David looked around the table at the faces of our family members, seeing his carefully constructed reputation crumbling in real time. His parents looked horrified. Mine looked confused but supportive. Our children looked scared but not surprised. I'd prepared them for this moment. You don't understand, David said desperately, his composure finally cracking. Everything I did was for us, for our future. The front door opened with the sound of heavy footsteps, and Agent Martinez appeared in the dining room doorway with two other federal agents. David Ronald Garson, she announced, her badge visible, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. As they read him his rights and placed handcuffs around his wrists, David looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger or hurt, but genuine shock that the woman he'd been manipulating had been capable of destroying him so completely. How long have you known? He asked, as the agents prepared to lead him away. Long enough, I replied, standing up from my chair with the dignity I'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation. Long enough to make sure you'll never hurt another family the way you hurt ours. The house felt eerily quiet after the FBI agents led David away in handcuffs. Our parents sat in stunned silence around the Thanksgiving table, the half-eaten meal growing cold as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Lucy had retreated to her room, and I could hear her quiet crying through the ceiling. Liam sat curled in my father's lap, asking the same question over and over. Is Daddy coming back for dessert? No, sweetheart, I said gently, kneeling beside my father's chair. Daddy won't be coming back for a very long time. He broke some very serious rules, and now he has to face the consequences. My mother-in-law, Patricia, finally broke her silence. Rachel, I don't understand. David's business has been so successful. Why would he need to steal money? It was a fair question, and one I'd anticipated. Over the next hour, I explained everything I'd discovered, showing them the documents Lucas had prepared, the surveillance photos, the evidence of David's systematic deception. I watched their faces as they realized that the son and son-in-law they'd trusted, the man they'd been proud of, had been running a criminal enterprise for years. The children in Denver, my father asked quietly, they're not really his. No, Christie Lavigne has been running cons on wealthy men for years. She borrowed her sister's children to make David's fake family seem more convincing. Those kids have no idea they've been used as props in a fraud scheme. David's father, a retired accountant who'd taught his son the importance of financial integrity, looked physically ill. All those times he talked about his expanding client base, the complex investments, it was all lies. Most of it, yes. David was using his legitimate business reputation to gain access to elderly investors, then convincing them to put money into fake real estate developments. He and Christie have stolen over $2 million from 8 different families. The weight of David's betrayal extended far beyond our family. His parents would have to face their friends and colleagues, explaining how their successful son had become a federal criminal. His professional reputation would destroy relationships they'd built over decades. And our children would grow up knowing their father was in prison for stealing from grandparents and retirees. Agent Martinez returned an hour later to conduct formal interviews with our family members and to explain what would happen next. David will be arraigned tomorrow morning, she informed us. Based on the evidence we've gathered, he'll likely be held without bail as a flight risk. Christie Lavigne was arrested simultaneously in Denver, and we've frozen all their known assets. What about the victims? I asked. Will they get their money back? We're working with financial recovery specialists to trace and return as much as possible. The Denver property will be sold, and all legitimate assets will be liquidated. It won't be everything, but it should cover most of what was stolen. After the agents left and our parents went home, I sat in our living room with Lucy and Liam, trying to answer their questions about what came next. They were confused and scared, but they were also resilient in the way children often are when adults provide honest, age-appropriate explanations. "Will we have to move?" Lucy asked. "No, sweetheart, this house is ours, and it's going to stay ours. Daddy can't take it away because what he did was illegal." "Are we poor now?" Liam wondered. "We're going to have less money than before," I admitted, "but we're not poor. And more importantly, we're going to be honest and safe. No more lies, no more secrets, no more wondering why Daddy was always traveling." The following weeks blurred together in a haze of legal proceedings, media attention, and the complicated process of rebuilding our lives. David's arrest made national news when reporters discovered the scope of his fraud scheme. Financial Advisor's Double Life read one headline. Thanksgiving Takedown read another. The story had everything journalists loved: wealthy criminals, elderly victims, a dramatic arrest, and the wife who'd orchestrated her husband's downfall. I hired a crisis management consultant to help protect the children from media intrusion, but there was no escaping the fact that their father's crimes were public knowledge. Lucy's school counselor worked with us to address the questions and comments from classmates. Liam was too young to fully understand the media attention, but old enough to sense that people were talking about our family. Patricia, my divorce attorney, proved to be worth every dollar of her substantial fee. She navigated the complex process of divorcing a federal criminal while ensuring that our financial interests were protected. The court froze all of David's assets, reversed his hidden transfers, and established a trust for the children funded by recovered fraud proceeds. But perhaps the most unexpected development came from Lucas's continued investigation into Christie's background. 3 weeks after David's arrest, she called with news that would change everything I thought I knew about my husband's motivations. "Rachel, we need to meet," Lucas said over the phone. "I've discovered something about David's relationship with Christie that puts his entire motive in a different light." We met at her office on a gray December afternoon, and what Lucas revealed made me question everything I thought I understood about my husband's betrayal. "Christie didn't just target David randomly," she explained, pulling out a thick file. "She's been planning this specific con for over 5 years, and her original target wasn't David." Lucas opened the file to reveal surveillance photos and documents I'd never seen before. "Christie Lavigne first investigated your family in 2018, but not because of David's wealth or business connections. She was targeting you, Rachel." The words didn't make sense at first. "Me? Why would she target me?" "Because of your father's death," Lucas said quietly. "And the life insurance settlement you received that David never knew about." My blood went cold. My father had died in a car accident when Lucy was 3, and his life insurance policy had left me with a substantial settlement that I'd invested privately, intending it as an emergency fund for the children. I'd never told David about the money, viewing it as my personal safety net. "Christie somehow discovered that settlement," Lucas continued. "Her original plan was to befriend you, gain your trust, and eventually convince you to invest that money with her. But when she researched your family more thoroughly, she realized David was a better target. His business connections gave her access to multiple victims instead of just one. The implications were staggering. David hadn't been Christie's original victim. I had been. She'd pivoted to targeting my husband when she realized it would be more profitable, but her investigation into our family had been going on for years before David even met her." "There's more," Lucas said grimly. "We have evidence that Christie may have arranged the circumstances of David's first meeting with her. She didn't just attend that financial planning seminar randomly, she engineered it specifically to make contact with him." As I sat in Lucas's office, processing this revelation, I realized that our entire family had been under attack for years without knowing it. Christie hadn't just destroyed our marriage, she'd been planning to destroy our lives long before David became her accomplice. But she'd made one critical error. She'd underestimated what I would do to protect my children when I discovered the truth. The trial began in March, 6 months after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner. David had attempted to negotiate a plea deal, but Agent Martinez and the federal prosecutors were determined to make an example of him. The scope of his crimes, the number of victims, and the sophisticated nature of his conspiracy with Christie made this a case they intended to prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. I attended every day of the proceedings, not out of loyalty to David, but because I needed to see justice served for all the families he'd destroyed. The courtroom was packed with his victims, elderly couples who'd trusted him with their retirement savings, widows who'd believed his promises of financial security, families who'd invested their children's college funds in his fake developments. Christie had already pled guilty in exchange for testimony against David, a decision that revealed the true depth of her calculating nature. Even in federal custody, she was working angles, positioning herself as the manipulated victim rather than the criminal mastermind. But the evidence Lucas and Agent Martinez had gathered told a different story. During Christie's testimony, the full scope of her 5-year plan became clear. She'd initially researched dozens of families in our area, looking for women with significant life insurance settlements or inheritances that their husbands didn't know about. My father's death and the subsequent settlement had made me a prime target, but when she'd investigated David's business connections, she'd realized she could make far more money by recruiting him as a partner, rather than simply conning me. She approached David with a business proposition, Agent Martinez explained during her testimony. Not a romantic relationship initially, but a partnership opportunity. She offered to help him hide assets and plan for divorce while providing access to wealthy clients she could manipulate. Pesti of sender pelti, bertalpinde desemed, but the wasted dis. The personal relationship developed later, as a way to ensure his complete cooperation. This revelation reframed everything I thought I understood about David's motivations. He hadn't fallen in love with Christie and then gotten swept up in her criminal schemes. He'd deliberately chosen to partner with her, knowing exactly what she was and what they were planning to do together. The man I'd trusted with our children's futures had coldly calculated that destroying our family was worth the financial benefits Christie offered. The most damaging testimony came from Christie's previous victims. Marcus Thompson from Phoenix took the stand and described how Christie had convinced him that his wife was planning to divorce him and take half his assets. She'd offered to help him hide money in offshore accounts and fake real estate investments, then disappeared with over $400,000 when he'd served his wife with divorce papers. She made me feel like I was protecting my life's work, Marcus testified, his voice breaking. She convinced me that my wife was the enemy, that I needed to be strategic to survive the divorce. I destroyed my marriage and lost my money because I trusted her. James Miller from Las Vegas told a similar story. Christie had identified his marital problems, positioned herself as a financial advisor who understood his situation, and gradually convinced him to transfer assets into accounts she controlled. By the time he realized he'd been conned, Christie had vanished and his wife had divorced him for adultery and financial deception. The pattern was always the same, the federal prosecutor explained during closing arguments. Christie Lavigne identified married men with substantial assets and existing marital problems. She offered them a solution that appealed to their greed and their fears, help hiding money from their wives while providing companionship and validation. David Garson wasn't her victim. He was her most successful partner. David's defense attorney tried to argue that Christie had manipulated his client, that David had been blinded by love and gradually drawn into criminal activity against his better judgment. But the evidence told a different story. David's own emails showed him researching asset-hiding strategies months before he'd claimed to have romantic feelings for Christie. He'd approached their partnership with the same methodical planning he used for legitimate financial strategies. The moment that sealed David's fate came when the prosecution played recordings Agent Martinez had obtained of David and Christie discussing their exit strategy. His voice was clear and calculated as he described how they would liquidate their stolen assets, abandon their current identities, and start over in a country without extradition treaties. "Rachel won't suspect anything until it's too late," David said on the recording. "She's too trusting, too focused on the children to pay attention to the business side. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll be gone and she'll be left dealing with the legal fallout." Hearing my husband dismiss me so casually, describing my love for our children as a weakness he could exploit, was more painful than any of his lies or betrayals. This was who David really was, not the charming financial advisor or devoted father, but a criminal who viewed his own family as obstacles to be managed. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. David was found guilty on all counts: wire fraud, money laundering, conspiracy, and RICO violations for participating in a continuing criminal enterprise. Christie received 8 years as part of her plea agreement. David was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. As the judge read the sentence, David finally looked at me directly for the first time since his arrest. I saw no remorse in his eyes, no regret for what he'd done to our family or his victims. There was only anger that his perfect plan had been discovered, and frustration that the woman he'd underestimated had been the architect of his downfall. Outside the courthouse, I was surrounded by reporters asking how I'd uncovered David's crimes and what message I had for other families facing similar betrayals. I kept my statement brief: trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate. And never let anyone convince you that protecting your family makes you paranoid. Agent Martinez approached me as the media crowd dispersed. "You know, Rachel, you'd make an excellent federal investigator. Have you ever considered a career change?" I smiled at the suggestion, but I already knew what I wanted to do with the rest of my life. The experience of investigating David's crimes had shown me how many families were vulnerable to financial predators like Christie. I wanted to use what I'd learned to help others protect themselves. 2 years after David's conviction, I stood in the conference room of Garson Family Protection Services, the consulting firm I'd built from nothing, addressing a room full of women who'd discovered their own husbands' betrayals. The irony of keeping David's last name for my business wasn't lost on me. It served as a constant reminder of how completely someone could fool you while also representing the strength I'd found in rebuilding from that deception. "The red flags are always there," I told the group, clicking through a presentation that had become my life's work. "We just tell ourselves stories to explain them away because we want to trust the people we love." In the front row sat Jennifer Mills, whose husband had been hiding gambling debts by refinancing their house without her knowledge. Next to her was Sarah Chen, who discovered her husband was running a cryptocurrency scam targeting their church congregation. Behind them, Maria Santos clutched tissues as she described finding evidence that her husband had been stealing from his elderly parents' care fund. These women had found me through word of mouth, media appearances, and referrals from divorce attorneys who'd learned that my investigative approach often uncovered financial crimes that traditional divorce proceedings missed. What had started as my personal quest for justice had evolved into a business helping other families protect themselves from financial predators, both strangers and the people closest to them. "The most important thing to understand," I continued, "is that financial abuse and fraud often begin with isolation. Your spouse convinces you that you don't need to understand the money, that questioning their decisions means you don't trust them, that managing finances is too complicated for you to handle." Jennifer raised her hand. "But how do you know when normal financial privacy becomes something sinister?" "My husband always handled our investments, and I thought that was normal division of labor." It was a question I heard frequently, and one that had haunted me during my own marriage. Privacy is one thing, secrecy is another. Privacy means your spouse doesn't share every detail of daily financial decisions. Secrecy means they actively hide information, deflect questions, or make you feel guilty for wanting to understand your family's financial situation. I clicked to the next slide, showing a timeline of David's deception. In my case, my husband spent 3 years gradually moving assets, establishing secret accounts, and creating financial obligations I didn't know existed. He made me feel like a good wife for not questioning his business trips, or demanding detailed explanations of his work. My trust was a tool he used against me. The presentation continued with practical advice I'd learned from Lucas, Agent Martinez, and my own painful experience. How to access financial records without arousing suspicion. Which professionals to contact when you suspected fraud. How to protect yourself legally while gathering evidence. When to involve law enforcement versus when to handle situations through civil courts. "But here's what I want you to remember most," I said, reaching the final slide. "Discovering betrayal doesn't mean you were stupid or naive. It means you loved someone who chose to abuse that love. The shame belongs to them, not to you." After the presentation, several women approached me privately with details too sensitive to share in a group setting. Maria Santos stayed until everyone else had left, then broke down crying as she described the full scope of her husband's theft from his own parents. "He's been their financial power of attorney for 5 years," she sobbed. "They trusted him completely because he's their son. He's stolen over $200,000 from their retirement accounts and used the money to fund his affair and a house he bought for his girlfriend. His parents think they're losing their savings to medical bills, but it's actually their own son stealing from them." I handed Maria the tissue box and sat down beside her. "Have you contacted Adult Protective Services?" "I'm scared," she admitted. "If I report him, it will destroy our children's relationship with their father. But if I don't, his parents will lose everything and end up homeless." It was the kind of impossible situation I encountered regularly in my work. Family members who discovered crimes but feared the consequences of reporting them. Children caught between loyal to parents and protection of grandparents. Spouses who knew their partners were criminals but worried about the financial impact of exposure. Maria, your husband made this choice when he decided to steal from elderly people who trusted him. You didn't create this situation by discovering it. You have an opportunity to stop it before his parents lose everything. Over the next 2 hours, I helped Maria document the evidence she'd gathered, connected her with elder abuse investigators, and outlined the legal protections available for victims of financial crimes against the elderly. By the time she left my office, she had a plan for protecting her in-laws without exposing herself to legal liability. These conversations had become my purpose. Each woman I helped felt like a small victory against the David Garsons and Christie Lavignes of the world. Every family that avoided financial ruin because they'd learned to recognize warning signs represented justice for the victims who hadn't been so fortunate. But my work had also taught me something unexpected about forgiveness and healing. I discovered that the opposite of betrayal wasn't revenge. It was helping others avoid the same pain. Every successful case, every family I helped protect, every predator we exposed felt more satisfying than David's conviction had. That evening I drove home to the house David had tried to steal from us, where Lucy and Liam were now 10 and 8 years old respectively. They'd adapted to our new reality with the resilience children often display when adults provide honest, age-appropriate explanations and consistent emotional support. Lucy had become fiercely protective of our family's financial privacy, often asking detailed questions about my business and the cases I handled. "Are you helping another family catch a bad guy, Mom?" she'd ask when I worked late or took weekend calls. Liam had channeled his confusion about his father into a passionate interest in justice and fairness. His school reports frequently featured stories about police officers, FBI agents, and people who catch the bad guys like Mommy does. Neither child had seen David since his arrest. He'd made no attempt to contact them from prison, which I chose to interpret as his final gift to our family, the chance to heal without his continued manipulation. As I tucked them into bed that night, Lucy asked me the question that had evolved over the past 2 years. "Do you think Daddy ever really loved us?" It was a question I'd struggled with myself, and one I'd discussed extensively with their therapist. "I think Daddy loved the idea of us," I replied carefully. "He loved having a family that made him look successful and trustworthy, but he didn't love us enough to choose us over money and crime." "That's not real love," Liam said firmly. "No, sweetheart, it's not. Real love means protecting the people you care about, even when it's difficult or inconvenient. Real love means choosing honesty even when lies would be easier." As I turned off their lights and headed downstairs to finish preparing for the next day's cases, I reflected on how completely our lives had been transformed. David had intended to destroy our family for his own benefit, but his betrayal had ultimately revealed strengths I'd never known I possessed, and led me to work that felt more meaningful than anything I'd done before. The perfect suburban wife he'd married was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned exactly how dangerous she could be when protecting the people she loved. And every day I used that knowledge to help other families discover their own strength before it was too late. 3 years after David's arrest, I received a call that would test everything I'd learned about justice, forgiveness, and the complicated nature of healing. Lucas Ronald was on the other end of the line, her voice carrying the same professional urgency I remembered from our investigation days. "Rachel, I need to meet with you about something concerning David," she said without preamble. There's been a development in his case that you need to know about. We met at the same coffee shop where I'd first learned the truth about Christie's targeting of our family. Lucas looked older, her silver hair now completely white, but her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had helped destroy David's criminal enterprise. David's been cooperating with federal investigators for the past year, she began, sliding a manila folder across the table. He's providing information about other financial fraud networks he was connected to before he met Christie. I felt my stomach tighten. What kind of cooperation? He's helping them trace money laundering operations, identify other con artists Christie worked with, and recover assets for victims of similar schemes. His information has led to 17 additional arrests and the recovery of over $8 million in stolen funds. The folder contained documents I couldn't have imagined reading 3 years ago, detailed reports of David's assistance to federal investigators, testimonials from other fraud victims whose money had been recovered because of his cooperation, and official recommendations for reduced sentencing based on his substantial assistance to ongoing investigations. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Because the federal prosecutors are recommending a sentence reduction. If the judge approves it, David could be eligible for parole in 8 years instead of 22. Lucas watched my face carefully. "They want to interview you as part of the evaluation process. Your opinion about his cooperation and its impact on your family will carry significant weight in the judge's decision." I stared at the documents, processing the implications. David, the man who had systematically destroyed our family and stolen from elderly victims, was now being praised for helping catch other criminals. The system that had imprisoned him was now considering rewarding him for turning against his former associates. "Has he asked to see the children?" I asked quietly. "No. In fact, part of his cooperation agreement specifically states that he won't seek contact with you or the children without your explicit consent. He's also agreed to continue paying child support from any assets recovered through his assistance, even though his original conviction eliminated that obligation." This information complicated the narrative I'd built about David's character. The man I'd divorced was selfish, calculating, and willing to harm innocent people for financial gain. But this cooperation suggested someone capable of recognizing the damage he'd caused and working to repair it, even if only partially. "I need time to think about this," I said finally. "Of course. But Rachel, there's something else you should know." Lucas hesitated, which was uncharacteristic for her. "Christie Lavigne died in prison 6 months ago. Suicide. She left a letter confessing to additional crimes, and specifically acknowledging that she had manipulated David's participation in their scheme more extensively than previously known." The news hit me unexpectedly hard. I'd spent years viewing Christie as the architect of our family's destruction, the criminal mastermind who had recruited David as her partner. Learning of her death felt strange, not satisfying or tragic, just final in a way I hadn't anticipated. "What did the letter say about David?" "That she had researched your family for over a year before approaching him. That she had specifically chosen him because his marriage appeared stable and his reputation was impeccable, which would provide better cover for their crimes. And that she had convinced him to participate by threatening to target you directly if he refused to cooperate." I felt the ground shift beneath me as I processed this revelation. She threatened me. According to her confession, she told David that if he didn't partner with her, she would befriend you, gain access to your father's life insurance settlement, and destroy your family's finances through a long-term con. She presented their partnership as the lesser of two evils, a way to protect you while still giving her access to the wealth she wanted. The implications were staggering. David's decision to work with Christie might not have been pure greed or a desire to abandon our family. It might have been a twisted attempt to protect us from an even worse fate. Christie had maneuvered him into a position where any choice he made would harm our family, then convinced him that partnering with her was the option that would cause the least damage. "Does this change anything legally?" I asked. "It could. The federal prosecutors are arguing that David was coerced into participating in Christie's scheme, which would support a reduced sentence. His cooperation has been extraordinary. He's helped recover more stolen money than any other informant in the history of financial fraud investigations. I left the meeting with my head spinning, carrying documents that painted a completely different picture of David's motivations than anything I'd understood before. The man I'd divorced might still be a criminal, but he might also be someone who had made terrible choices while trying to protect our family from an even worse fate. That evening, I called my sister Joy and explained the situation. She listened without interrupting, then offered the perspective that had always made her my most trusted advisor. Rake, does it matter why he did it? He still chose to steal from elderly people. He still lied to you for years. He still put your children at risk. Good motivations don't excuse criminal behavior. She was right, but the revelation about Christie's threats added complexity to a situation I'd thought was resolved. David wasn't the man I'd married, but he also wasn't exactly the monster I'd divorced. He was something more complicated, someone who had made criminal choices while believing he was protecting the people he loved. The question now was whether that complexity changed my responsibility to our children and to the victims whose lives he'd helped repair through his cooperation. Whether forgiveness was possible for someone whose crimes had been committed in service of misguided protection, and whether I was ready to face the man who had destroyed our family, knowing that his motivations had been more complex than I'd ever imagined. The federal prosecutors wanted my recommendation within 2 weeks. I had that long to decide whether David Garson deserved a second chance at freedom, and whether our children deserved the opportunity to know their father outside of prison walls. The decision became clearer after I spoke with Marcus Thompson, one of Christie's victims from Phoenix. Agent Martinez had provided contact information for several people whose money had been recovered thanks to David's cooperation, and I wanted to understand what his assistance had meant to the families he'd helped. Mrs. Garson, Marcus said when I called, his voice warm despite the circumstances that connected us. I've been hoping to speak with you. Your husband's cooperation has been extraordinary. I still flinched when anyone referred to David as my husband, but I let it pass. Can you tell me what happened? How his information helped you? Christie didn't just steal from me, Marcus explained. She was part of a network that targeted military families across the Southwest. They'd identify servicemen going through divorces, offer to help them hide assets from their wives, then disappear with everything. David's information led the FBI to a storage unit in Nevada, where they'd kept records of over 40 families they'd defrauded. The scope was staggering. 40 families. My case was just one piece of a much larger operation. Christie and her associates had stolen over $12 million from military families over 5 years. Without David's cooperation, most of us would never have seen a penny of our money back. Marcus went on to describe how David's detailed knowledge of Christie's methods had helped investigators trace money through multiple offshore accounts and cryptocurrency exchanges. His cooperation had been so valuable that prosecutors in 3 different states were using his information to build cases against other members of the fraud network. I know this is complicated for you, Marcus said quietly. David was part of the conspiracy that hurt your family and mine, but his cooperation has helped dozens of families get their lives back. My daughter can afford college now because of the money they recovered. That has to count for something. After hanging up, I called 2 other victims whose money had been recovered. Their stories were similar, families who'd lost everything to Christie's network and had given up hope of recovery until David's cooperation led investigators to hidden assets and additional conspirators. But it was my conversation with Agent Martinez that provided the context I needed to make my decision. She called 3 days before my deadline to offer her professional perspective on David's cooperation. In 20 years of financial crimes investigation, I've never seen a federal informant provide information as valuable as what David has given us, she said. He's helped us understand how these networks operate, how they identify victims, and how they move money to avoid detection. His cooperation will help us prevent similar crimes for years to come. But he was part of those crimes, I pointed out. Yes, and he's serving time for that, but his cooperation suggests genuine remorse and a desire to repair the damage he caused. The question is whether the justice system should incentivize that kind of cooperation or focus purely on punishment. I thought about Lucy and Liam, now 11 and 9 years old. They'd grown up believing their father was a criminal who'd chosen money over family. The revelation about Christie's threats didn't excuse David's choices, but it provided context that might help them understand his actions as they got older. That weekend, I sat both children down for the most difficult conversation we'd had since David's arrest. I explained that their father had been helping the FBI catch other criminals, that his cooperation had helped other families get their stolen money back, and that the government was considering reducing his prison sentence as a result. "Does that mean Daddy might come home?" Liam asked. "Not home to live with us," I clarified. "Daddy and I are divorced, and that's not going to change. But it might mean he gets out of prison sooner than we originally thought." Lucy, always perceptive, asked the harder question. "Do you think we should see him if he gets out?" It was a question I'd been wrestling with for weeks. "I think that's a decision you'll get to make when you're older. For now, we're just trying to understand what's right and fair for everyone involved." "Will you tell the judge to let him out early?" Liam wondered. I took a deep breath before answering. "I'm going to tell the judge the truth, that Daddy made terrible choices that hurt our family and other families, but also that he's been working to help fix some of the damage he caused. The judge will decide what's fair." The next morning, I called the federal prosecutor and scheduled my interview. I'd decided what I would tell them about David's sentence reduction, and the decision felt both painful and necessary. 2 days later, I sat in a conference room with federal prosecutors, a court reporter, and Agent Martinez, providing my official statement about David's cooperation and its impact on our family. I spoke about the damage his crimes had caused, the ongoing effects on our children, and the difficulty of rebuilding our lives after his betrayal. But I also spoke about the families he'd helped through his cooperation, the money he'd helped recover, and the future crimes his information might prevent. I explained that while I couldn't forgive David for destroying our marriage, I could support reducing his sentence if it meant other families wouldn't suffer the way we had. Mrs. Garson, the lead prosecutor, asked, "Do you believe David's cooperation represents genuine remorse for his crimes?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe David is trying to repair damage he knows he caused. Whether that's remorse or just recognition of consequences, I can't say. But the result has been meaningful help for other victims, and that's more important than his motivations." "Would you object to his early release if the court approves the sentence reduction?" "I wouldn't object," I said. "Finally, as long as there are conditions that protect our children's privacy and ensure he continues helping other fraud victims. David made choices that destroyed our family, but if his cooperation can help other families avoid that pain, then justice includes giving him that opportunity." Walking out of that courthouse, I felt the same sense of closure I'd experienced 3 years earlier when David was first sentenced. Not because the situation was resolved, our family would always carry the scars of his betrayal, but because I'd chosen to prioritize healing over revenge, recovery over retribution. 6 weeks later, Lucas called to inform me that the judge had approved David's sentence reduction. He would be eligible for parole in 5 years, contingent on his continued cooperation with federal investigators and his agreement to have no contact with our family without court supervision. That evening, I explained the decision to Lucy and Liam, answering their questions and reassuring them that our life together would continue exactly as it had been. David's early release didn't change our family's security, our home, or our future plans. It simply meant that someday, if they chose, they might have the opportunity to know their father as something other than a federal prisoner. 5 years later, on a crisp October morning similar to the one when I'd first discovered David's betrayal, I received the call I'd been expecting but still wasn't prepared for. Agent Martinez's voice was professional but warm when she informed me that David would be released from federal prison the following month. "He's completed all requirements for his cooperation agreement," she explained. "His information led to the recovery of over $15 million in stolen funds and resulted in 43 convictions across 7 states. The parole board has approved his release with standard supervision conditions." Lucy was now 16, a junior in high school with David's analytical mind and my determination. She'd grown into a fierce advocate for financial fraud victims, often helping me with research for my consulting business. Liam, at 14, had channeled his sense of justice into debate team and student government, already talking about studying law in college. Both children had known this day was coming, and we'd spent years discussing what David's release might mean for our family. They'd never expressed interest in seeing him, but they'd also never definitively closed that door. As they'd matured, their understanding of his crimes had deepened, but so had their ability to process complex emotions about family relationships. "Mom," Lucy said that evening as we prepared dinner together, "are you going to tell him about us? About school and our lives?" It was a question I'd considered many times. "Only if you want me to. This is your choice, both of you. You don't owe him anything, but you also have the right to make your own decisions about whether you want any kind of relationship with him." Liam looked up from his homework at the kitchen table. "What do you want us to do?" "I want you to be happy and healthy and safe," I replied honestly. "Whether that includes your father or not is completely up to you. There's no right or wrong answer." 2 weeks after David's release, Lucas called with unexpected news. "He started a nonprofit organization," she reported. "It's called Second Chance Financial Recovery, and it helps fraud victims navigate the legal system and recover stolen assets. He's working with the FBI as a consultant and speaking at conferences about financial crime prevention." The irony wasn't lost on me. David was now using his criminal expertise to help the kinds of people he'd once victimized. Whether this represented genuine redemption or simply another calculated strategy, I couldn't say. But the results seemed meaningful for the families he was helping. A month later, I received a letter addressed to me in David's familiar handwriting. I held it for 3 days before opening it, unsure whether I was ready to hear from the man who'd destroyed our marriage, but whose cooperation had potentially prevented similar destruction for other families. The letter was brief and careful, clearly written with legal advice. David acknowledged the pain his crimes had caused our family, expressed gratitude for my support of his sentence reduction, and asked whether Lucy and Liam might be interested in meeting him when they felt ready. He included information about his nonprofit work and a statement that he would respect whatever decision our children made about contact. He wrote to us, "I told Lucy and Liam that evening, showing them the letter. He's not asking for anything specific, just letting us know he's available if you ever want to meet him." They read the letter silently, then exchanged a look that reminded me of all the times they'd communicated without words during the difficult years after David's arrest. "Not yet," Lucy said finally. "Maybe someday, but not yet." Liam nodded in agreement. "We're not ready, but maybe when we're older we might want to ask him questions." I felt proud of their thoughtful response, and their ability to make decisions based on their own emotional readiness, rather than external pressure. They'd grown up understanding that forgiveness and reconciliation were complex processes that couldn't be rushed or forced. As I filed David's letter away in the folder where I kept all documents related to his case, I reflected on how completely our lives had been transformed by his betrayal and its aftermath. The perfect suburban family he'd destroyed had been replaced by something more authentic, a mother and 2 children who'd learned to rely on each other, to question when things seemed too good to be true, and to find strength in truth rather than comfortable illusions. David's crimes had been devastating, but they'd also revealed capabilities I'd never known I possessed, and led me to work that felt more meaningful than anything I'd done before. Our family was different now, scarred but stronger, smaller but more honest, forever changed but ultimately more resilient. 2 years after David's release, Lucy called me from her freshman dorm at Columbia University, with news that surprised me. "Mom, I've been thinking about meeting Dad." She was 18 now, studying criminology and economics, and had spent her senior year of high school writing her college application essay about growing up as the daughter of a financial criminal. Her perspective on David's crimes had evolved as she'd learned more about white-collar crime and victim impact through her studies. "What changed your mind?" I asked, settling into my office chair and closing the case file I'd been reviewing. "I'm working on a research project about financial fraud recovery programs," Lucy explained. "Professor Williams mentioned Dad's nonprofit as one of the most effective victim assistance organizations in the country. I want to understand how someone who committed these crimes became so effective at helping victims recover from them." It was a mature, analytical approach that reminded me of the girl who'd asked pointed questions about justice and fairness throughout our family's ordeal. Lucy had always processed difficult emotions through intellectual understanding, and I could see how studying David's work might help her make sense of her relationship with him. "Have you talked to Liam about this?" I asked. "He's not ready yet, and that's okay. This is something I need to do for myself, for my research, and maybe for some closure I didn't know I needed." 3 weeks later, I drove Lucy to a coffee shop in downtown Hartford where David was waiting. I'd spoken with him briefly to arrange the meeting, and his voice had carried the same careful restraint I'd heard in his letter. He was grateful for the opportunity, but understood that this was Lucy's decision and would proceed entirely on her terms. I waited in the car while Lucy went inside, watching through the window as she approached a man I barely recognized. 8 years in federal prison and 2 years of nonprofit work had changed David physically. He was thinner, grayer, and carried himself with less of the confident swagger I remembered. When he stood to greet Lucy, his movements were hesitant, uncertain. They talked for nearly 2 hours. I saw Lucy taking notes, asking questions with the same methodical approach she brought to her academic work. David listened more than he spoke, and from my distant observation, the conversation appeared professional rather than emotional. A criminology student, interviewing a subject rather than a daughter reconnecting with her father. When Lucy returned to the car, she was quiet for the first few minutes of our drive home. Finally, she spoke. "He's different than I expected. More broken, I guess, but also more genuine than I remembered him being when I was little." "How do you feel about seeing him?" "Confused," she admitted. "He talked a lot about the work he's doing now, how he's trying to make amends for what he did, but he also acknowledged that nothing he does can undo the damage he caused us. He didn't try to excuse his behavior or make himself seem like a victim." Lucy went on to describe their conversation, David's detailed explanation of how financial fraud networks operate, his description of the victim recovery process, and his frank assessment of his own crimes and their impact on our family. "The strangest thing was when he thanked me for growing up to be someone who fights for people who've been hurt the way we were hurt," Lucy continued. "He said he was proud that his daughter became someone who protects victims instead of creating them." "How did that make you feel?" "Angry, at first. Like he was trying to take credit for choices I made despite him, not because of him. But then I realized he was right about something. Watching what happened to our family did shape who I became, just not in the way he probably intended." That evening, Lucy called Liam at his boarding school to tell him about the meeting. I could hear only her side of the conversation, but it was clear that Liam was processing the information carefully, asking thoughtful questions about David's appearance, demeanor, and their discussion. "He says he's still not ready," Lucy reported after hanging up. "But he's glad I went. He wants to know that Dad is, I don't know, human, I guess. Not a monster, but not someone he needs to forgive either." A month later, Lucy submitted her research paper on financial fraud recovery programs, using David's nonprofit as a case study in how former criminals could contribute to victim assistance efforts. She earned an A on the project and a recommendation letter from her professor that helped her secure an internship with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit the following summer. When I read her paper, I was struck by its analytical objectivity and emotional maturity. Lucy had managed to study her father's work without either demonizing him or excusing his crimes. She'd found a way to acknowledge the value of his current efforts while maintaining clear boundaries about their personal relationship. "I don't think I'll see him again regularly," Lucy told me, after her paper was published in the university's criminology journal. "But I'm glad I understand better who he is now. It helps me understand who I am too." That night, as I prepared for another day of helping families protect themselves from financial predators, I reflected on how far we'd all come from that devastating Thanksgiving dinner 8 years ago. Lucy was becoming the kind of professional who could prevent other families from experiencing what we'd endured. Liam was developing into a thoughtful young man with a strong sense of justice. And I had built a career dedicated to protecting families from the kind of betrayal that had once destroyed ours. David's crimes had shattered our perfect suburban illusion, but in its place, we'd built something more authentic and more resilient. We'd learned that strength comes not from avoiding betrayal, but from how you choose to rebuild afterward. 10 years after that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, I stood in the same dining room where I'd confronted David with the evidence of his crimes, preparing for what had become our new family tradition. The table was set for 5 instead of the large gatherings we'd once hosted: myself, Lucy and her boyfriend James, Liam, now home from Harvard Law School, and my sister Joy, who'd become the children's surrogate aunt during the years when David's extended family had distanced themselves from us. Lucy, now 21 and working as a financial crimes analyst for the Treasury Department, helped me arrange the centerpiece she'd brought, autumn flowers from the farmer's market near her apartment in Washington, D.C. "Remember when you used to stress about getting everything perfect for Dad's family?" she asked with a smile. "I remember thinking that was what mattered," I replied, adjusting the candles, making sure everyone else was comfortable while I managed all the details behind the scenes. Liam, taller than David had ever been and possessing a quiet confidence his father had never achieved, carried dishes from the kitchen. At 19, he'd already been accepted to several prestigious law schools and spent his summers interning with organizations that provided legal aid to fraud victims. "This feels better," he said simply. More honest. The conversation inevitably turned to David, as it did every few months when something reminded us of the life we'd left behind. James, who'd heard our story but never met David, listened with the fascination of someone trying to understand how families recover from such fundamental betrayal. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found those documents?" he asked me. It was a question I'd considered many times over the years. "We probably would have lost everything," I admitted. David and Christie were planning to disappear with our assets within months. I would have been left with divorce papers, massive debt, and no idea what had happened to our family's savings. "But you did find them," Lucy pointed out, "because you trusted your instincts when something felt wrong." Joy raised her wine glass in a toast to trusting your instincts even when it's terrifying. As we clinked glasses, I reflected on the unexpected gifts that had emerged from David's betrayal. The three young adults at my table had grown up understanding that security comes from integrity, not wealth. They'd learned to question authority, verify information, and protect themselves and others from manipulation. Most importantly, they'd discovered that love means choosing someone's well-being over your own comfort, a lesson David had never learned. "I have news to share," Liam announced as we started dessert. "I've been offered a position with the National Consumer Protection Bureau after graduation. I'll be working on a task force that investigates financial scams targeting elderly victims." The pride I felt was overwhelming. Both of my children had chosen careers dedicated to protecting people from the kind of predators who'd destroyed our family. They'd transformed their pain into purpose, their vulnerability into strength. "Dad would probably be proud," Lucy said quietly, "and also terrified that his own children became the kind of people who catch criminals like him." "David made his choices," I replied. "You too made yours. The fact that you chose to protect people instead of hurting them says everything about who you are as individuals." Later that evening, after our guests had gone home and the dishes were washed, I sat in my study reviewing case files for the next week's client meetings. 10 years after starting my consulting business, I'd helped over 300 families protect themselves from financial predators, recover stolen assets, and rebuild their lives after betrayal. The work had evolved beyond individual consulting to include training programs for law enforcement, educational seminars for community groups, and advocacy for stronger consumer protection laws. What had started as my personal quest for justice had become a comprehensive effort to prevent other families from experiencing what we'd endured. On my desk sat a framed photo from Lucy's college graduation, all three of us smiling in the sunshine outside Columbia's campus. We looked happy and confident, not the broken family David had left behind, but something new and stronger that we'd built together. The perfect suburban wife who'd trusted blindly and asked no questions was gone forever. In her place was someone who'd learned that the most important protection you can give your family isn't financial security or social status. It's the ability to recognize deception, the courage to seek truth, and the strength to rebuild when everything falls apart. That Thanksgiving dinner 10 years ago had destroyed everything I thought I wanted, but it had also revealed everything I never knew I needed. The knowledge that I was capable of protecting my children, fighting for justice, and building a meaningful life from the rubble of betrayal. As I turned off the lights and headed upstairs, I felt grateful for the hard-won wisdom that had emerged from our family's darkest moment. David's crimes had been meant to destroy us, but they'd ultimately shown us who we really were and what we were truly capable of achieving. Sometimes the worst betrayals become the foundation for the strongest transformations. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.